Welcome to the SPSS tutorial for partial correlations. This is Dr. Zapku. In this tutorial, you will learn how to conduct a partial correlation using SPSS and then use the SPSS output to write an APA results section. If you have not already completed the correlation tutorial, I highly encourage you to stop here and complete that tutorial prior to completing this one. In this tutorial, we will be considering the following research question. Is there a significant relationship between online university students' sense of isolation and perceived learning after controlling for students' perception of teaching presence? Accordingly, our null hypothesis in which we will be testing is there is no significant relationship between online university students' sense of isolation and perceived learning after controlling for a student's perception of teaching presence. Considering both the research question and the null hypothesis, you'll note that we have three variables in which we will be working. We have two continuous variables in which we're looking at the relationship between. We're looking at the relationship between sense of isolation and perceived learning. We also have a covariate in which we will be controlling for, and it's a continuous variable called teaching presence. Since we have two variables, continuous variables, in which we wish to explore the relationship between, and one continuous variable in which we wish to control for, conducting a partial correlation makes sense because it allows us to explore the relationship between two variables while statistically controlling or basically getting rid of the effect of another variable that we see may influence the relationship between the two variables that we're studying. Now that we understand the research problem that we'll be looking at, let's go ahead and get started in SPSS. Once you've opened SPSS, open the data set in which you desire to work. Here we are going to be using the correlation practice data set. Here we'll find all three of our variables listed. Community, which stands for our isolation variable, learning, which is our perceived learning variable, and TP, which is our teaching presence. Using this data set to conduct a partial correlation, from the menu at the top of the screen, click Analyze, then click Correlate, then click on Partial. In order to progress in this tutorial, click on the Partial button. When you click on Partial, the partial correlation box will open. You first want to click on one of the continuous variables in which you wish to correlate. Here we're going to click on Community. Click the button next to the Variables box to move the community variable into the variable box. Click the arrow button to progress in this tutorial. Now we will select the second variable in which we wish to correlate. Here it's perceived learning. We click on perceived learning. Again, click on the arrow box next to the variables box to move perceived learning into that box. Click on the arrow button to progress in this tutorial. Next, you want to click on the variable you wish to control for. Here we click on teaching presence. We move this variable teaching presence into the controlling for box by clicking the arrow next to that box. Click the arrow to progress in this tutorial. Now that our variables are in the correct boxes, we click Options. The Options box will appear. We first want to tick the means and standard deviation. This ensures that our descriptive statistics are shown in our SPSS output. Next, we tick the zero-order correlation. This ensures that the zero-order correlation value is shown in our SPSS output. Later in this tutorial, you will see why this is important. We also have the option of how we want to deal with missing values. Here I have exclude cases list-wise because I know that the N will not be restricted by this. However, for the most part, you usually want to tick exclude cases pairwise. Remember, using the list-wise deletion, any case with missing data on the variable will be removed, and this really can restrict your N. In this specific case, if I excluded cases pairwise, my N value would have been around 430. However, since I excluded it listwise, I have an N value of around 423. Again, in this case, excluding things listwise was not that big of a deal, but for the most part, you always want to exclude things case-wise. Once you've ticked mean and standard deviation, zero-order correlation, and exclude cases pairwise, you can go ahead and click Continue. Take you back to the partial correlation box. Next, we want to make sure that we tick two-tailed. Remember, the hypothesis that we're working with is non-directional. If it was directional, we would tick one tail. Also make sure that you tick Display Actual Significance. After you're done, click OK. In order to progress in this tutorial, go ahead and click OK. This will generate the SPSS output for our partial correlation. Once the SPSS output is generated, the first step that you want to take is to check the sample information to ensure that the number is correct and you aren't missing a bunch of data, and then note the descriptive statistics so that you can report them in your APA results section. Note here in the descriptive statistics box that sense of isolation mean is 26.74 and standard deviation is 5.85. Perceived learning mean is 60.56 and the standard deviation is 12. And the teaching presence variable mean is 5.30 and the standard deviation is 2.02. These will all be reported in your APA results section. Next, you will look at the correlations table. Note that there are two parts to the correlations table. On the top half of the table is the normal Pearson's product moment correlation matrix between your two variables, not controlling for the other variable. Then the bottom half of the table repeats the same set of correlation analysis, but this time it's controlling for the effects of the control variable. First thing that you're going to look at in the correlations table, and the second step that you're going to take, is to assess the significance level. Here we're going to look at the bottom half of the chart. Note in the significant two-tail row that the significant level is 0.000. Since the alpha level, let's say that we set was 0.05 and this is less than 0.05, we can say that we've reached statistical significance. Roll your mouse over the significance level to see how to report the alpha level in APA. When you're done, click the R value for the correlation between the two variables without controlling for teaching presence to progress. Remember, when we're not controlling for teaching presence, we're looking at the top half of the table. The third and final step that you will take is to assess the direction and strength of the relationship between the variables and then compare the two sets of correlation coefficients. That is, compare the correlation coefficient on the top half to the bottom half. Let's take a closer look at this. The correlation between the sense of isolation and perceived learning while controlling for the perception of teaching presence is negative 0.55. What we know about negative 0.55 is that that is a strong negative relationship. We then look at the zero-order correlation between the sense of isolation and perceived learning. Here we're not controlling for teaching presence. The correlation coefficient is negative 0.58. Again, this is a strong negative correlation. Once we've identified the two correlation coefficients, we then want to compare these two sets to see whether controlling for the additional variable had any impact on the relationship between the two variables. In this example, there is only a small decrease in the strength of correlation from negative 0.58 to negative 0.52. This suggests that the observed relationship between perceived learning and isolation is not merely due or not simply due to the influence of teaching presence. Once you are done looking at this slide, please click the R value or the correlation coefficient between the two variables without controlling for teaching presence to progress. Remember, it's the top part. Now that you've had the opportunity to examine the SPSS output, let's look at how we can use this output to write an APA results section. Read the example provided, and then when you're finished, click on anywhere on the slide to progress in this tutorial. Completing the SPSS tutorial for partial correlations. You should now be able to conduct a partial correlation using SPSS as well as use the SPSS output to write a results section, an APA results section for a partial correlation.